All right, let's start. Good morning. I'm Sunita Sarabji, contributing editor at Ethnic Media Services, and I'm your moderator today. I would like to start this morning's roundtable discussion with a question for our audience. How many of you know someone who has been afflicted with COVID or been afflicted with COVID yourself? Please use the reaction feature down below to raise your hand. I see 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, fairly significant number of people. So I think we are at varied opinions on where we are in this pandemic. Even as COVID hospitalizations plateau in some regions of the US, cases are rising in others, and hospitals are overwhelmed with a large number of people who are stricken with severe cases of COVID, the majority of whom are unvaccinated. The Centers for Disease Control has temporarily postponed today's briefing with Ethnic Media Services. The administration is expected to make a major announcement later today. Instead, our guest experts this week, who are all familiar faces, will join us for a roundtable discussion with a focus on possible new variants in the pipeline, what form they are likely to take, whether in fact we're moving towards an endemic, as many would suggest, and the role of therapeutics, among other issues. Our speakers this morning are Dr. Ben Newman, Chief Virologist at the Global Health Research Complex at Texas A&M University, Dr. Dolly Phan, University of California Davis Health Science Clinical Professor and a volunteer vaccinator at California North State University in Elk Grove, California, and Dr. Monica Gandhi, Professor of Medicine at UCSF, who will be joining us for the latter half of our roundtable. Reporters, please enter your questions in the chat box. We hope to have a very robust, interactive discussion today. And to our speakers, please speak slowly for our interpreters who are simultaneously interpreting in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean. And a very hearty thanks to all of you who have joined us today for this important roundtable discussion. And now we begin. Perhaps we should start with the announcement this morning from the CDC that boosters and vaccines are now shown to be effective in infected Americans against the Omicron variant. Dr. Phan, I'm sorry, would you like to begin the discussion?
Well, that's hardly surprising, but if you look at the data from Israel, from South Africa, we know that even though the protective effect of 2 shots Pfizer vaccine, the protective effect waned from 80% to about 30%, but a booster shot re-elevate back to 70%, and that is in South Africa, where Omicron variant was prevalent. So this was a good piece of news. The undertone of the news is that get vaccinated, get the booster shots.
Absolutely. Dr. Newman?
Yeah, so what we know from several studies is that somewhere between 1/10 and 1/80th, 1/80, of your neutralizing antibodies will still work against Omicron. And 1/10 of a larger number of antibodies gives you better protection. That's it. So that's why boosters are a good idea. And yeah, there are several studies now from around the world that all seem to agree on this.
Can I maybe I'll just add something that just to remind everybody that our immune system is complex. So the hormonal effect measured by antibody production is only one part of the protective effect. Cellular response can also be, and in most situations, more protective, more important for our general protection. and that is not generally measured. It is also can be hypothesized that the booster effect, that boosting the cellular immune response is still even more robust.
Absolutely. So given that the vaccine wanes in effectiveness after a period of time, will we need to continue to have boosters? Will we in fact have to get fourth and fifth boosters as we go along, boosters every 6 months? Dr. Newman?
It's not clear whether this is the case, but at the moment, based on the data we have, I think I would agree that boosters are likely. However, there is still the possibility that at some point we will get to some level of immunity that is actually going to last for a reasonable length of time. We just cannot say that yet because we have not seen that yet.
Dr. Fan?
I agree. I think current recommendation is 3 shots. The 4th shots have been tried in Israel. Just measuring the resurgence of antibody level after the booster shot is not as impressive as the 3rd shot. And then the ability to curtail the infection rate in Israel has not been as robust. So it is not only that whether we should have a 4th or the 5th shot or not, but also the time of the booster shot. Whether it's 6 months or it's 12 months or later, it's still unknown. I think time will tell.
At our last discussion, Dr. Newman, you suggested that the CDC needs to possibly change its definition of fully vaccinated. And I wonder if you would still say that at this point, or if you could re-emphasize that point that you'd made at our earlier discussion.
Good heavens, yes. The glass is full. If you put more in, it spills over and you have a mess. The immune system does not get full. So boosters are a good idea, and these are just additional doses of the vaccine that raise, as Dr. Fan said, both the levels of cellular immunity and antibody immunity. And they give you both broader protection and more protection. They are a good idea, and they are the best idea that we have so far to deal with this, I think.
Dr. Fan, do you also agree that the CDC might change its definition of fully vaccinated?
Well, I think it's a matter of formality, but please remember that the protective effect are graded. In other words, unvaccinated is the least protective, and then more shots you get, the immune system gets boosted. Whether that translates into protection against hospitalization, against death, against infection, it needs to be vetted more thoroughly. I think more data needs to come before we give a graded rating of the vaccinated people.
Absolutely. There's already a question in the chat from Henrietta Burrows relating to the conversation that we're having. Henrietta, could you ask your question now?
Thanks, Anita. I heard this morning that there's studies that can show on the basis of the level and kind of antibodies in the body that it can be shown who is most vulnerable to getting COVID. Are any of you familiar with these studies? And I'm wondering if the level of antibodies in the body also impacts the breakthrough cases.
Dr. Newman?
Okay, sure, as you like. Yes, there are many different tests that can be done that are trying to get at the answer to your question, which is essentially, will I be protected? There are also mathematical models that say if you have a certain amount of a certain type of antibody, you can expect protection. However, the best models that we have now can only predict with about 85% accuracy. So if you have a certain amount, you are 85% likely to be protected, but we cannot say, there is no point where we can say you are 100% likely to be protected, because the immune system is complex and there are many cells the virus can infect. And yeah, there's a lot of randomness. built into the process. There are tests. There is one small test strip out of China, which will look specifically for neutralizing antibodies, or at least gets close to this. There are also tests that will be done in a laboratory that can look for this. They are useful, but remember the 85%. None of the results on here can be necessarily relied upon completely.
Dr. Fan, would you?
I think it's a complex issue. Or one is the science part of it. As Dr. Newman already said, I mean, the immune system is very complex, and the measurement of antibody is a very small aspect of the immune system. So I'm not aware of any good correlating studies, meaning if your antibody level is above X, you're Y protected. If it's below Z, you're A protected. I don't think it's that simple. I don't think it's a one-to-one correlation. It is also, I need to be emphasized that it is not true that the more the merrier in terms of the antibody. You can overactivate your immune system. That's why you have all the side effects of vaccination. So not only the antibody level, but the peaks and valleys of it, and the timing of boosting it, and the kind of antibodies, in addition to cellular and other immunoprotective responses, are all part of the same picture. So I would caution to use antibody alone to make a call one way or the other.
Interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Francis Espiritu of the Philippine News sent a question ahead of time, and I think this sort of frames the discussion. When do we expect to see a peak of the Omicron variant, and what target number or percentage must we reach before we can say we have effectively fought off the virus? Dr. Fan, would you like to start?
I'm not an expert in the epidemiology part of it, but if you, the best figure is to take a look where Omicron started. Omicron started in South Africa and then went to England very quickly. So if you look at them, the peaks and valleys, actually they peak very quickly within the first week or two, and then they come down very, very quickly as well. That's the hallmark of Omicron spread across the globe. I think that's the same thing happens in New York, in the United States. I think it spread westward towards the middle part of the country in the United States, and also to the West Coast as of right now. So I think we're peaking in the West Coast. I think like in New York, which has already come down after a couple of weeks, I think we should, in California, I think we should peak now or in the next week, and then come down by early February.
Dr. Newman?
That is a reasonable prediction. It's hard to tell with these things, and I am also not an epidemiologist. The one confounding factor that I see here in Texas and in some other hard-hit states is that the testing centers are overwhelmed, and so we are under-reporting because we are under-testing at the moment. So to some extent, I'm not sure how much we can believe the apparent slowing in the number of cases. Certainly, at some point, the cases will slow, and most likely the northern part of the United States started off this wave before the South, and so probably the South will follow the North perhaps a month later, but these are very rough predictions.
I just want to add something. I think I read from Massachusetts. I think it's almost 100% of the new cases are Omicron. But as you move westwards, most of the surge of cases in the western part of the United States are a combination of Delta and Omicron. That is not only the Omicron that's taking over, but also the holidays travel season. They triggered a surge that's mostly Delta. So you see a change of composition of different variants also.
Dr. Fan and Dr. Newman, could you explain how it is that we identify which variant is the predominant variant in a particular region? I think that deserves a little bit of background explanation, if you wouldn't mind. Dr. Fan, do you want to start, or?
I think Dr. Newman probably was the
Yes.
better person to answer that question, but I don't think we genotype every single infection that we have. So you spot check and get a ratio of how many are Delta, how many are Alpha, how many are Omicron. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Newman.
No, absolutely. It's the same as taking a political poll. You can't survey every voter, so you survey a sample, and that's what it's based on. We generally sequence whole genomes, but these spikes are different enough between Omicron and Delta that you can get a reasonable estimation just from looking at the spike or by doing a test called a spike dropout in the PCR, where you look for a particular part of the spike and this part is deleted in Omicron, and so you will not get a response, but you will show with other tests that the virus is present.
Before we move on to variants, Dr. Fan, a question came in for you. At your volunteer vaccination clinic, are you seeing a weariness in people about getting vaccines and getting boosters? Has the interest in getting vaccinated sort of waned?
The volunteer clinic has pretty much waned down to non-existence.
Okay.
At the beginning of the pandemic, where people just get very enthusiastic to be vaccinated, you see lines of people. But then as more local pharmacies open up, many primary care offices open up, then people tend to congregate to familiar places like their local pharmacies and their primary care offices. In general, when you're in vaccination clinic, you hear people talk about fear of infection, fear about the side effect, not the side, fear about long COVID, the aftermath. But then when you talk about, when you're clinic, when you meet people who are against vaccination, you hear about side effects, you hear about different rumors about various things that are true or untrue about the vaccines. So there are two kinds of fear. And for us, I am advocating for vaccination. So you unfortunately have to talk to each individual about what kind of fear they have. If their fear is infection, they're in your camp, you can get them vaccinated and boosted. But if their fear of the side effect, then you have to dive into the science a little bit. So the fears are different and the talking points are different for different people.
Interesting. Sarah Apit asks a question. Sarah, would you like to ask your question? I will ask it for her because this leads to a bigger question. Is Omicron the last variant of concern that we are likely to see? Sarah asks, could we create a new variant here in the US after this Omicron infection? So I think there are two questions here, there, but if you could answer both, let's start off with Dr. Newman.
Yeah, as long as this virus grows, it will change. And as it changes, eventually it will move beyond the reach of some parts of our immunity. And at that point, we have something that is, at least at a practical level, a new variant. So yes, this is inevitable as long as the virus grows. Now, as to whether it can happen here, yes, I don't see why the virus would not change wherever it is growing, and there is a lot of virus growing in America at the moment.
Dr. Fan.
Again, I mean, that's just not my field, but for the simple answer is yes, the change is default for this kind of virus. They're not very accurate. They don't photocopy themselves very well. Each generation, they change. So that by definition is a variant. Some time ago I learned immunology from a good immunologist, and his description of this variant is that there are certain ways Actually, most of the variant of the virus is not viable. They just die. So there are rules within the virus system that they can change so much and still be a viable virus. So and that's one thing. The other thing is just look at the previous well-known pandemic. It's the 1918 Spanish flu. How many peaks and how many generations of variants that they created. Although we don't have accurate data, but we can sort of have a reasonable guess of how many generations and how did it eventually go away, just like every other viral pandemic. I'm not convinced that the Spanish flu vanished because the people in the globe were vaccinated naturally by 1920. I think there are other unknown factors that makes the whole virus just disappear. I don't know what that is. Probably Dr. Newman, being a virologist, probably can tell me a little bit more. I feel that there are more things about the nature of the rise and fall of the virus themselves play a much bigger role than we actually know about it.
Dr. Newman, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. There are so many factors. And one of those is competition between other viruses. We only very recently got a sequence from the 1918-1919 flu. And we only have that from a few people in one part of the world. For the most part, we can't even be certain that a lot of those people definitely died from exactly the same thing. Most probably it was, but there are so many unknowns that, yes, it is very difficult to predict. And I would agree that we probably don't have all the information we need to solve that problem.
I'm just gonna throw a wild guess or hope that I think eventually the COVID virus, just like other virus, will choke themselves. Just they will change into a dead end and corner themselves to death. I think. I don't know that, but that's my hope.
Would you agree, Dr. Newman?
And here again, this is opinion. This is after the facts stop and we keep going. I don't know that there is enough reason to base any sort of policy on this. It is my hope as well, but as we understand evolution, it is driven by what we call evolutionary pressures or selective pressures. These are basically benefits that the virus gets if it does a certain thing as opposed to another thing. The problem right now is I do not see any selective pressure that would lead to a milder version of the virus. The virus normally spreads within the first week after infection. And if a person is hospitalized or even dies, that usually happens 2 weeks to 4 weeks later. And so the virus has been and it is gone by that point. And so there is no benefit or detriment to the virus in changing that particular aspect. And so for that reason, I don't think I trust the virus to change in the way that I would like it to change. And I don't think we should base any policies on the virus changing to suit us. I just don't think viruses are trustworthy in that particular way.
So then that leads to a good question by Manny Otico. Manny, would you like to ask your question now?
Yes, my question is, with the current rates of infection and also the death rates, do you think it's safe for schools to be open right now?
Dr. Fan?
I do. I think it's always a balance, not just in infectious disease, but also in any other field. You balance the risk and benefit. The benefit of reopen schools and the benefit of reopen the society, I think right now outweighs the benefit of shutdown and protect infection. I think in our last update, when there were 6 of us who predicted what's the thing that you're worried about in 2022 of COVID infection, I think the other 5 people about their concern was about vaccination, but my concern is not. My concern is the side effect of shutdown society and its aftermath.
Dr. Newman.
My expertise is only in virology, and so I take a very narrow view. Anything that we do which leads to more virus, I would say we should not do, and anything which leads to less virus, I would say we should do. From that very narrow perspective, schools could potentially be run if we're willing to mask or vaccinate. Without that, I don't like it, but only from that narrow perspective. And I acknowledge that the other perspectives are real as well. They're just not something where I can comment in an expert capacity.
I think a follow-up question for both of you would be, what can we how can we safely engage in our communities? How can we go back to what we considered pre-pandemic norms? Should restaurants be open? Should large companies allow unvaccinated people to continue to work at the workplace? Dr. Fan.
There's no good answers to that. I think, well, let's go back to the basics. What we do know. What we do know is boosted vaccinated people are the best protected. So get your booster shots, period. And then the common sense measures are wearing masks and keep social distancing and wash your hands more frequently. And with regard to schools and companies, I think it is difficult, at least in my opinion, to have a uniform countrywide from the federal level measures for everybody. I think it needs to be tailored in local situations.
Mira Kaimal has a question that is related. Mira, would you like to ask your question? I'll ask Mira's question for her. The UK has dropped COVID restrictions to slow the spread of the highly transmissible Omicron variant. Does the science actually support this? Dr. Newman.
No. So the UK is still chasing herd immunity. And like all the other countries that have chased herd immunity, they are finding that it is elusive for this particular virus. With the amount of infection and the amount of vaccination in America, we should be at roughly the threshold where herd immunity would be protecting us if this were a viable concept for SARS-CoV-2. I think the concept of an immunity window is more useful. And I think the window may only be about the length of a booster being effective or the length of an immune response to the virus being effective, which is somewhere around 6 months for most people and up to a year. In that case, by allowing the virus in, you potentially buy yourself a 6-month respite, but you also almost guarantee yourself a much larger problem in another 6 months. And it is very difficult to have every single person in the country infected at the same time, both from the perspective of hospitals and from just a logistical perspective. So I think TLC said it best, don't go chasing waterfalls, essentially. Herd immunity is a bad thing to go after.
Dr. Fan?
The epidemiology part of it is beyond the scope of my expertise. I think in a way, if you look at a cancer, for example, of a disease that's not infectious, or let's say in my field, it's chronic angina. You try to stent it, you try to bypass, you do everything you can to mechanically provide more circulation back to the heart. But at some point, you're going to have to say that enough is enough. And then the patient had to live on. There's a life to live, their families to feed, the works to be done. So at that point, you have to live with angina in my field. And then by the same analogy, we have to learn to live with COVID, no matter how brutal it is.
Terrific. Peter Sherman and Pilar Marrero both have interesting questions. Peter, would you ask your question first?
Sure. Hi. I'm curious if you could turn the clock back a year or 2 years as scientists. What would you do differently, if anything, in terms of how you've approached this pandemic? Thank you.
I can start, and yeah, you can fix whatever I make wrong. As scientists, I don't know. Oh, as a scientist, I don't know that the science has been the problem. Granted, if we had a way to make a vaccine and have it ready before the pandemic started, that would be fine. But we have not ever found a way to vaccinate against the unknown, and I don't think that's realistic. I would say, look at the difference between World War II and the Vietnam War. In World War II, you had a public that was almost 100% on the side of a particular course of action before the action started. In the Vietnam War, you had a very divided public, and then the action was taken anyway. The situation with COVID and vaccines is very much more divided, like the Vietnam War, and we see the conflict, I think. If I could do something differently, it would be somehow, and I am not an expert in this, but somehow at the political level, building support for the idea of vaccination, for the idea that a virus from me can infect someone else, and we both have a responsibility to prevent that infection. And from the idea that the country working together is healthier, better, and stronger than the country is with different groups opposing each other over this one very destructive cause.
Dr. Fan?
I don't think I have a lot to add. I mean, I think at the very beginning when it started in Wuhan, there might have been something that could theoretically be done. I don't think people knew enough at the time to even go for extreme measures. So once the virus spread into the United States, remember, we're the third tier countries, and it started in China and then went to Iran and Italy, and then coming from Europe, it went to New York and then spread from that westward. So tracking back, I don't know if there are one particular fatal mistake that was made that would have changed the course of the event afterwards. So we put a lot of hope on vaccination, on the vaccines. We got it as quickly as we could. And then the testing, and then the policy changes. Retrospective scope is always good, but even if I have the time of 2020, at the beginning of 2020, I think total shutdown of a free society, it's not only not feasible in the United States, it's not feasible as proven by the steps afterwards in almost every country in the world except a few, in China, North Korea. So I don't know if things can be done dramatically different to make a difference.
Thank you. Pilar.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm driving and I'm about to enter an iffy area for a connection. But anyway, I'm wondering at what point we're going to say the level of COVID we have is what we're going to have, just like we do with the flu. The flu kills tens of thousands of people every year. We cannot get zero COVID. There are many doctors and experts saying right now that Omicron is actually the most contagious virus in history, and it is also milder than Delta and Alpha and all the others we've had before. So why not talk about this as an optimistic potential for this to be turning endemic as we speak?
Dr. Fan?
Dr. Newman can correct me. I think measles is more contagious than COVID. Yeah, I mean, I think that falls back to the concept that you have to live with the virus. It's like you live with angina, you live with cancer, you have to live with it. I think we will work around the fact that COVID virus will not go away. Even if we have everybody infected in the same time in the world, we can vaccinate animals. I mean, I don't know if they become a pool of infection after we vaccinate every human being on Earth. If that's the case, and then we have to live with it, learn to live with it.
Just Dr. Newman.
Yeah, the difference is that in the US, in a given year, the flu will kill between 12,000 and 60,000 people. And in a given year, COVID will kill several 100,000 people. So this is a very much more serious problem. And while we have seen that vaccination or immunity can protect against some of the effects, there are still considerable numbers, even in our highly vaccinated world, who are still suffering from severe effects and dying. The hospitals keep filling up every time we have one of these, and there are 6 states right now that have over 70% of their ICUs filled with COVID patients. This is not sustainable, and I don't know that planning for a future with more disease is worth planning for, to put it bluntly. I would still favor an approach that gets rid of COVID, and I do not believe we have come to the point where we have to give up. And that's essentially what people are talking about when they talk about the disease becoming endemic or being endemic. They're talking about a shift in how we feel and how we respond to COVID. I would argue, and here again, this is not science, this is just opinion, but I would argue that we should fight this thing. And if we go down swinging, I'm okay with that. But I'm not done with this thing until we have exhausted every possible opportunity to get rid of COVID once and for all. Because the reward for doing that is a world where you don't have to worry about COVID and you don't have to live with that number of deaths and hospitalizations in the ones you love. And I think that's worth fighting for.
That's a really powerful statement. Khalil, could you ask your question?
Yes, it's real quick. I was just wondering whether there had been any data on reinfections as opposed to the solo. If that is, I'm sure it's being collected somewhere, but I was wondering whether there's any resource or study you could point to, just say on the most recent variant and how many people have been reinfected, or how many times if they have been reinfected.
At the beginning of the chat, I posted a couple of links. The first paper in there is the largest study looking at Omicron compared to Delta. And if that doesn't show up for you, I can post it again. That one has 200,000 Delta patients compared to, I believe, 16,000 Omicron patients. And it also looks at reinfection and concludes that Omicron is, I believe, about 6.5 times more likely to reinfect than Delta is. So I don't know if that answers all of your question, but Omicron is different enough that some people's immune systems will struggle to stop it before it gets in. That doesn't necessarily mean that you will have the full consequences, because there are other components of immunity that can protect to some extent. But it does mean that the infection will start and can potentially spread.
Thank you.
Dr. Fan?
I think that says it all. I mean, I know 1/10 of the data that Dr. Newman knows, so we'll take that as the answer.
Okay. Michelle White has a question. Michelle.
I'm here.
Yes, there you go.
I'm wondering, well, I'm just curious because I've heard lots of comments of people being around, like they live in the same household and one has COVID and it's just like walking around and just totally fine. And somebody got a really, really bad flu and is in bed and having a bad time and it's not COVID. So what is the difference? And I just wanted to ask you, like, if I know vaccine equity, we're like very far away from that still, but that would definitely play a role in future, the future outcome of variants of Omicron or Delta, whatever, COVID.
I think.
So it's
Dr.
21.
Do you want to address the vaccine equity question first, Dr. Pan and Dr. Newman?
I think Dr. Newman stepped away. I don't
No,
know.
he's back.
Oh, he's
Yeah.
back. Okay. I think the first thing is about individuals' response to an infection. So it's pretty much determined by your genetic background, how your body is made up, and how you respond to a single dose of, let's say, virus invasion. If you give the same dose to me, to Dr. Newman, or to Sunita, to you, our body responded to differently, even if we're vaccinated or unvaccinated to the same extent. So some of us will get really sick, others won't even feel a glitch. So it's just a matter of how, that I think it's an explanation of a single household. Some people get really, really sick with COVID, others that don't feel a glitch.
Dr. Newman, could you address Michelle's question of vaccine equity, which we've discussed previously?
Not as well as I can amplify Dr. Fan's statement.
Okay.
So those are anecdotes, and the anecdote is the enemy of the statistical truth, basically the totality. You can't look at one instance and expect to generalize it. This is what science does. We build up enough tests that you can say, on average, this is what is likely to happen, or this is what is most likely, second most likely to happen. There is no yes or no in science. There is only a p-value and a statistical confidence interval, really. And so by comparing extremes of two different things, we don't necessarily arrive at the truth, which is to say, I'm happy for the person that got COVID and was okay, and I'm very sorry that the person got flu and was not. But these are not the average. These are extremes, and they stand out in the mind because they're a little different than what we expect. And this is one of those human biases that we try to get around with statistical analysis in general. In terms of vaccine equity, I cannot argue against it. There are multiple variants that appear to have at least begun to grow in Africa, wherever they actually originated. And I think that's no surprise, given that that is one area where there is probably the least vaccine availability on a continent by continent basis. We can solve these problems and we can make these problems worse based on how the vaccines are distributed. And it's hard to argue against equity in just about anything.
Vidya Sethuraman, could you please ask your question?
Hello.
Yes, hello, Vidya. Welcome.
One of my cousin, he turned positive. He's a school student. He turned positive last Friday, and we've been testing him till today. He's still positive, but no symptoms. Little bit cough here and there. So when can he come out of the isolation, and when can he get back to the school? Even the school is confused on when he can come.
This is the question of the day, given the confusing messages coming down from the CDC. So
I
could you
think
please
for our policy, it's the appearance of day 1 of symptoms or test positive as day 1. And then 10 days after that, you can come out of isolation without retesting. That is, I think that's our policy before the CDC updates it today.
Dr. Newman.
I hope the CDC updates their policy. Yeah. Can you repeat the last part of the question? I had it and lost it. I apologize. Yeah.
How long is the isolation?
Oh, yeah. Test negative, then go back. That's the only safe way to do it. And yeah, anything else is a policy decision, not necessarily a science-based decision. Not all policies are grounded in science. We do things for different reasons. And yeah, from my narrow perspective of trying to make less COVID in the world, anything other than that is probably going to make more COVID.
I have a question actually for Dr. Newman. What do you think of the PCR positivity versus infectivity? What's your take on that?
There's a good new study from Switzerland. It's a preprint. And what they found is that they are much more able to isolate infectious virus from the Delta and Omicron variants than from previous variants. In terms of infectivity, it is difficult to show infectivity because our cell culture systems are not great. For a normal virus, it will take about 10 virus particles to generate one infection somewhere in cell culture. For this virus, the best I think anyone can do is about 3,000 viruses per one infection. This is a problem with our way of booting up the virus, finding out if it is infective, not necessarily a problem with the virus itself. And I don't think the virus would be able to survive or spread as it does if this were the case in general. So I think this is a gap in our knowledge, but I think the virus is changing to become more infectious, and it's doing it by multiple ways. Omicron has a very stable spike. It doesn't fall apart like Delta. Delta has changes in the nucleoprotein and in a protein called NSP4. And those may give it enough of a boost after it gets in that it's able to be very competitive. But there's still so much we don't understand that it's hard to answer that question definitively now and possibly ever.
Michael Fitzgerald, you had a question. Michael.
How about that?
Yes.
Okay. My question is about what I hear and I read frequently in different media outlets, not mine just yet. Is Omicron really a less troublesome, we'll call it troublesome variant than Delta? I even heard Pilar mention it sort of a little while ago, driving in a car. And I just wonder if we can really say, can we really say that from a medical perspective versus the Delta variant?
No. I will post the paper again.
Okay.
There was an early study from the CDC that looked at 6 people and concluded it might be milder. There has now been a much larger study with about 250,000 people from the UK that concludes that there is no meaningful difference in severity, that Omicron is essentially just another version of COVID, and it hits people about as hard. Any difference that we see is more likely to be due to pre-existing immunity from infection or vaccination. And we know those things can protect. So there's the hope always that the virus will change to suit us. But here again, I think there is a better explanation.
Okay.
Dr. Fan?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know the literature as well. I think it's worthwhile pointing out that the mortality rate, the hospitalization rate is now built on top of at least 60% fully vaccinated people in the United States. 70% of us at least have one shot. So you recalculate the bad rate, meaning hospitalization or death rate, on a different background than initially when nobody was vaccinated. So it's comparing two different things.
Okay.
Before we move on to the next question, I wanted to say that Dr. Monica Gandhi, who last summer told us that we need to move from pandemic to endemic, is unable to join us today because of a faculty meeting. So we will miss her presence, and we will miss her differing point of view with Dr. Newman, but we'll move on from there. Peter, you had a couple of interesting questions. Could you please ask them now? Peter Sherman?
Hi, sorry, thank you. I was trying to get off mute there. So the first one, it may be a little bit out of left field, but I'm curious, there's a lot of discussion about the link between climate change and future pandemics. Humans are there's more incursion into natural areas. For example, in Brazil, the Amazon is a hotbed of diseases. There was, I can't remember the disease that affected babies, the size of babies' heads, but in any case, there's talk of that. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on kind of the link between climate change and future pandemics. The second question is that there was a study out, and I'm seeing it all over the social media, the link between cannabis or CBD oil and preventing infections, COVID infections. I worry that will lead people to sort of say that vaccines are not important. I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that. Thank you.
Do you want to start, Dr. Fan?
I mean, it's human diseases is in a generative definition is disturbance of normal physiology. I mean, it's always an interplay between our physiology and the environment around us. I'm not a scientists in physics and climate change, but I don't think we know enough to say how much actually what we do can change anything if you put it in a bigger picture. I mean, I think the best climate change and human effect that I can find was American Physics Society. They have a statement paper, and I trust the physicists more than the other people combined. So I was just gonna leave it at that. I don't know what a CBD is in Canada. I don't know what that is.
Cannabis, pot.
Oh, pot. I think there. I don't remember the literature, so I'm not going to comment on it. But I just leave it with vaccines are the most effective weapon we have so far.
Dr. Newman.
Yeah, so I pulled up that paper. Thank you for giving me time, Dr. Fan. The paper says that you would need, I think it's about 10 micrograms per mil of this particular substance that you can find in cannabis. That is at about 1/10 of what is the lethal level in monkeys. So it's one of these cases where you can protect cell culture by doing a lot of things that you wouldn't be able to do inside of a human body. I guess stay in school, kids, get a vaccine rather than smoking. Thank you.
Let me just add something just based on personal experience. I mean, before I went back to medicine, I was a PhD student and I got my degree. And there's a very different from doing laboratory science versus dealing with human level issues or let alone societal issues. So things that worked in cell cultures and even well-studied models, when they have to translate into your real human being, and let alone into policies, there's a huge jump between A to B to C. So yes, even if it has a future, it's a long way to go before we actually even start to think about the reality of it.
Okay, we have time for a final question, and that comes from Sandy. We build this invite as, are we moving from a pandemic to an endemic? And Dr. Newman, you have addressed this question previously. I don't think, Dr. Fan, you have stated your viewpoint on this. If we are, in fact, to move from pandemic to endemic, would you agree with that premise? And then how do we do that safely? What parts of our economy, schools do we reopen? We have addressed this question, but I'd like your viewpoint again on this. Dr. Fan?
Oh, okay, sorry about that. Okay, again, I mean, I do. I think eventually we're gonna move towards an endemic, but I always fall back to the things that I do know. I'm a cardiologist. I use chest pain. I use angina as an example. Then with all the bypasses and stentings that you can do, and you are going to live with 50% lesions and 60% stenosis, and then you have to rebuild your life around it, knowing that no, we're not going to make the heart perfect, but we're gonna survive. We're gonna move on. We're gonna move to build better things in life. So that involves many different things, and control your cholesterol, stop smoking, control blood pressure and sugars, and the same thing. Use that analogy to COVID. Get yourself vaccinated. Use common sense of social distancing. Wash your hands. Pay attention to personal hygiene, and just be conscious about the existence of it, and then be educated about new changes.
Okay, final remarks. For each of you, what is the main lesson each of you have drawn thus far from our fight against COVID? Dr. Newman, this question comes from Sandy Close.
That's a good question. Yeah, we can do anything we set our minds to, but that works better on an individual level than on a population level. I think that's the observation and the reality. We've got a lot of tools that we didn't have before. And I would say there's no benefit, no health benefit to catching COVID. There is a price you pay. You can get some immunity, but the price you pay is a very real risk of severe long-term problems in the heart, in the lungs, throughout the body. And you never really know what you're getting when you get into COVID. So I guess the only message I would like to get out there is that there's still hope, and that I still think we have not exhausted the possibilities or even really tried to use all the tools that we've made yet. So stay strong and we can get through this. There you go. It's your Oprah moment. Yeah.
Dr. Fan.
Okay, so I think the lessons, at least I learned, are two things. One is be bold. I think if you look back, the vaccines is definitely the most effective weapon that we had. Operation Warp Speed really brought it up as fast as we could. So sometimes you just have to bet on something, and that could easily be wrong. That could easily be bet against us. But make the bet is what you should do. And the other one is adjust. Listen, my belief probably it's more opinion than science, is that this pandemic will come and will go just like every other one. Either one, it will kill every one of us, which I don't think it will, or it will just disappear as the previous pandemics that happened before us. So learn to adjust, do things that can be done that make a difference, not just to do things to spin the wheel and just get everybody run around, and it ended up with no benefit. So be bold, make moves, and adjust, and wait for the good things to happen, which I think it will.
Two very different points of view. Thank you both for such a robust discussion. We really appreciate it. We haven't got to many of the questions that I still have, but maybe you'll join us again for a future briefing. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. We finished the session out.
Thank you for having me.